point, I am recording the meeting, and we will go from here. So I want to do three things tonight as part of our live session. First thing I'm going to do is take you through a quick demonstration of a technique for teaching language skills that I think you will find useful. It's my own personal favorite way of teaching Hebrew language. It works especially well with children because it's really the only way they can learn. It also works with adults and it works with adolescents. And the method I'm going to show you can be done live, but I've got it set up so that you can also do it as an online kind of presentation. In fact, when I teach Hebrew online, this is exactly the way that I go about doing it. So that's going to be the first part. The second part will be going through the questions that many of you submitted and kind of walking you through those answers. And, I also invite all of you to participate in that piece if anybody has anything specific to add. And then the final piece I'd like to do is open it up for a discussion on some of the issues that are not related specifically to subject matter, but that are brewing within the American Jewish community and that certainly have an enormous impact on the subjects that we teach. So with that said, I am going, pardon me? Hello? Sorry, I'm not able to hear you. I'm not sure if you're speaking on a phone. No, okay. This said, I'm going to go forward with the language method. And what I'm going to tell you is that the language that you are going to be hearing is not Hebrew. Too many of you speak Hebrew too well. So I'm going to teach you some vocabulary in a language other than Hebrew. So as soon as you understand the word that I'm saying, I'm going to ask you to repeat it. So join in as soon as you understand it. The word is El Rey.
El Rey.
El Rey.
El Rey. El Rey.
El Rey. Anybody guess what language?
Rey.
Anybody guess what language we're doing? El Rey.
El Rey.
El Rey. David.
Rey.
David es un rey. David. David es un rey.
El Rey.
Is it Spanish?
David es un rey. You're close. David es un rey.
David es un rey.
Shlomo es un rey. Shlomo es un rey.
Shlomo es un rey.
David es un rey de Israel. David es un rey de Israel.
David es un rey de Israel.
David es un rey de Israel. Shlomo es un rey de Israel.
Shlomo es un rey de Israel.
Muy bueno.
French? Spanish.
This is the dead giveaway word. El Angelo.
It's Italian. Italian.
No, it's not Italian. El Angelo.
Portuguese.
You're all tap dancing around it. El Angelo. Michael es un angelo.
Michael es un angelo.
Michael es un angelo. El Angelo.
El angelo.
Michael es un angelo. Gabriel es un angelo.
Gabriel es un angelo.
Gabriel y Michael son angelos.
Spanish.
Gabriel y Michael son angelos.
Is it Latin?
No, you're all tap dancing around it. Gabriel y Michael son angelos.
Gabriel.
Gabriel y Michael
Gabriel y Michael
son angelos.
son angelos.
Son angelos.
Latin?
You're close. Cabeza.
Cabeza.
La cabeza.
La cabeza.
La cabeza.
La cabeza.
La corona.
La corona.
La
How about
corona.
not Spanish?
It's close.
La corona.
Latino.
La corona. Dia.
La Dia.
Latino?
Noche.
Noche. Noche.
Whoever said Ladino, you got it. And the dead giveaway is that in modern Spanish, it's not Angelo, it's Angelo. But Ladino has a J in it, so that anything that has a J in modern Spanish, the J is pronounced in Ladino. So it's not la mujer, not la mujer, it's la mujer. Ah, so we have noche.
Oh,
We have noche. Okay.
noche.
Sobre.
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 Sobre. Sobre.
La corona está sobre la noche, está sobre la cabeza del rey.
Oh boy.
La corona
La corona
está sobre
es sobre
la cabeza
la cabeza
del rey.
del rey.
Crown is on the king's head.
Uh-huh, very good. Okay, derecha.
Derecha.
La derecha.
La derecha.
That's a direction.
Uh-huh, la derecha.
La derecha.
La sierra.
La sierra.
La sierra. So
La sierra.
who can tell me what la derecha is?
To the right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And
Right.
la sierra.
Left.
Uh-huh.
To be left.
Right and left. Okay, we have David y Shlomo.
David y Shlomo.
Shlomo a la sierra.
Shlomo a la sierra.
David a la derecha.
David a la derecha.
A la derecha.
A la derecha.
A la derecha.
A la
To the
derecha.
right.
Right. A la sierra.
A la sierra.
A la
No,
sierra.
a la izquierda. A la
So-
izquierda.
Okay, so we have la corona este sobre la cabeza del rey.
The crown is on the king's head.
Right. Now we have de. You remember David, el rey de Israel. David, el rey de Israel.
David is Israel king.
David is the king, what?
Of Israel.
Of Israel. And de means?
Of the.
Of. Okay, good. So when you have de and el, it becomes a contraction, del. Del rey means of the.
Of the.
Of the king. Okay, so we have dia. Yes, dia.
Yeah.
What's this?
Noche.
Noche. And this?
Mm.
Rey.
El Angelo?
El Rey.
El Rey.
El Rey.
Sí, el Rey. Non el Angelo. Sí, el Rey.
Corona.
La Corona. Bien.
Ceviche.
Roche.
Roche.
Cabeza.
La Cabeza.
Angelo.
Angelo.
El Angelo.
El Angelo. Sí, el Angelo. Dia.
Día.
Yeah.
Noche.
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 A derecha.
A la derecha.
Yeah.
A la something.
A la si. A la siedra.
Izquierda.
A la siedra.
Izquierda.
Okay. This particular approach is called the direct method, and the hallmark of the direct method is that it uses as little translation as possible. When you're presenting the new material, both new vocabulary and new grammatical items, you try to do it in a direct way without going through an intermediary like translation. So this is a very modern method. It was invented in 1631 by an educator. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. It is also it's also really the most modern method that we have, which is really funny in many respects. It was invented initially by John Amos Comenius, who used it to teach Latin. He felt that trying to get kids to just sit there and do tedious conjugations and translation exercises was a pure waste of time, and that he felt that you learn much more through sensory channels than you do through, just pure cognition. And in particular, the visual channel was the one that he was promoting. And it has been subsequently reinvented by different names over the intervening centuries. But it is actually the method that most current linguists recommend in terms of teaching language, especially when we're talking about children. And in our last week, you'll see an actual demonstration of one of the leading linguists in the country who will show you exactly how this works. So anyway, whenever possible, the learner is asked to deduce the meaning of vocabulary and the meaning of grammar. And you get the meaning of this through what is called comprehensible input. So some parts of the comprehensible input of the lesson that you just had was the picture. And part of it was the context of the sentences. And sometimes it was a combination of both. You may not understand every word in a passage, but you have enough of it so that you can glean the general broad meaning. Again, it uses pictures, realia, which is actual objects, and movement to illustrate verbs as much as possible. Some of you may have taken the Hebrew through movement class. That uses a method known as TPR, total physical response, which is a direct method, but it focuses specifically on verbs. And the direct method is really, the demonstration you just had is particularly good for nouns. Translation is used, but it's used as little as possible. There are just certain times that you cannot illustrate. There are certain times that you just cannot illustrate a word using a picture. There are certain words that simply defy that. So that is our first presentation. And when I do this actual method as a demonstration, I give people a little text. Those of you that can see it, I will actually post this. Looks like we're not going to actually be able to see too much of it. I will post this up on Moodle as well. And at the bottom, you'll see that there is a little passage, all in Ladino, which you will be able to understand once you go through this worksheet again, once you review the vocabulary. And I illustrate it with a great little video clip from YouTube, which I'm going to share with you at this moment. This is from Yoram Gaon's incredible video from 1992. It's called From Toledo to Jerusalem. And this particular passage, he is speaking in Ladino. The Hebrew at the bottom will translate it, but I'll quickly summarize it for you, actually, when he's done speaking.
I'm not hearing anything.
I'm not either.
You're not able to hear it?
No, and I think mine is playing very, very slowly. I don't know if that might be my connection or it.
It could also it could also be it could be any number of things. All right. So what I'll do is I will post this up on the on Moodle. It will give you a chance to see exactly how this would work within the context of teaching a piece of text. It's a fascinating little video clip. Just to let you know, he says that, he reminds everyone that 3 stars at the end of Saturday night signal the end of Shabbat. But when he was a child, his father forbade him to point to the sky when counting them, because for the Sephardic Jews, the Inquisition in Spain had published any number of things about what constituted Jewish practice, and one of the things that the Inquisition looked for was people pointing to the sky and counting on Saturday night. So even 500 years after the Inquisition, even growing up free in Jerusalem, he was his father still would not allow him to do anything that might bring him before the Inquisitional authorities. So that's the initial presentation, and that will help you as you look at different ways that we have for teaching Hebrew language in our final week. And what I'd like to do now, are there any questions specifically about this particular method? Okay.
It seems like the purpose of that is really just to learn vocabulary, though, not for reading, right?
Well, the things are connected. There's certainly vocabulary, but as you'll see, once you have mastered the vocabulary, then you can apply it to reading a text, and it will make your reading a very different kind of experience. The more words that you understand, the more chance you have to read with fluency and with accuracy, and it's also a much more enjoyable process. Okay, I'm now going to go on to the questions that people submitted specifically. Those of you that sent them in over the last few days, These are the questions that you submitted. I took the liberty of kind of cutting and pasting them into a format that made sense and was organized. And the first category of questions have to do with differentiated learning. So one question was, how do you address 20 or more students who are all at different levels? And this is a big challenge for everybody. This particular past year, I had 2 fifth grade classes. One had 18 students, one had 22. And both of them were groups that met only one time per week. So the same issues that you guys have been dealing with, I also get to deal with in terms of the elementary students that I work with. And both of those classes contained a whole array of skill levels. So occasionally I would be able to put kids into small groups. If I had several kids that all had the same problem, I could do a small group activity with them while other kids in the class were working on other activities. If you can do that, if you can divide the class up into groups that need, one group needs to review vowels, so you do an activity for them. Another group has issues with lookalike letters. You can do an activity for them. Another group is already light years ahead of both of the first groups, and so you give them a more sophisticated, more advanced activity. It is possible to do it that way. You cannot obviously run a whole class that way all the time. But when I would find that there were specific issues that needed to be addressed, that was one way that I had of dealing with it. Another related question is, how do you handle students at various skill levels in the same class? And the person actually made this into a multi-part question. Do you call them up individually during class time? And the answer is whenever I can. But with 22 kids in the class, I simply did not have enough time to test each of them individually. Couldn't be done. Simply could not be done. So periodically I would test individual students individually and work with them on specific skills, but I couldn't do that as an ongoing event. And seeing them after class was also not an option because there was no way in the structure of the day to do that. My first period class immediately had to go to their religious studies class, and while they were leaving, my second period class was coming in. And the minute that the second period class was done, everybody was going home, and I couldn't hold up the carpool lanes. So seeing kids after class was also not an option. I could refer them to get some assistance to come in an extra day and work with the school director. Some kids, some parents were very receptive to that, many were not. And one option that I did have was I did have a madrich in the class. I did have a teen assistant, and really enjoyed going out and spending one-on-one time with him, which was a very positive thing. So it was not a negative. They didn't feel excluded because they were no longer in the class and they were being singled out somehow. No, they actually all wanted to go with him most of the time. The only issue with that is that when you're dealing with a teenager, I wasn't always sure that he could intervene with them the way that needed to be. So sometimes I would have him take the best readers in the class and I would work one-on-one or in a small group with the kids who were particularly weak. So those are the different ways that you can handle approaching different students who are all at different levels. I'm not sure if anybody else has something that they would want to add to that.
I do. This is Cheryl.
Hi, Cheryl.
Our school is set up so that we have a handful of adult, not madrechim, but a handful of adult tutors, so that once we identify a particular problem, we can make a referral to our director and say this person would benefit. We have to have parent approval. We cannot do it without them knowing. And then they go ahead and they pull them from class and maybe spend 10 minutes with them.
Right. Yeah, we have that also, and I did make use of the adult tutors as well. In particular, one of the adult tutors is a certified learning disability specialist. And so all I would have to say to her is, you know, this child is having issues with syllabification and oral blending, and she would know exactly what to do. So that is helpful.
Okay, the only problem we had is that our school is so big and we have so few adult tutors that also doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Right. Right. And again, it would be great if I had 22 adult tutors available when I had 22 kids in the class, but that doesn't happen either. Yeah. And even sending kids out two at a time doesn't necessarily do it. And 10 minutes is great one-on-one, but sometimes that's also not enough. So there aren't a whole lot of there are no perfect solutions to the problem, but there are some solutions that are a little better. Anybody else?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
I will pair students up of varying abilities and have them work in small groups.
So do you do like a jigsaw kind of thing where you have a very strong student, a medium student, and a weak student all together in one group?
It usually turns out to be pairs.
Okay.
But sometimes I'll have an odd group out. Sometimes I'll choose by ability, and sometimes they choose by their friends. It just depends. I'm lucky because I also have anywhere from 1 to 3 madrahim, depending on the day. So they will also oversee groups.
Got it. Yeah, peer tutoring. It's a very good strategy. Again, some kids really hate it because they don't want to be the teacher in the class, but sometimes it works very, very well. And if it,
I try to stress to those students that to truly learn something is to teach it.
Right. Right. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. The next broad category of issues that people brought up was the issue, it's an issue of overall structure. One person asked if we could go over a sample unit for a particular prayer. I will say we're going to do this tonight, but there's a much deeper lesson on this coming up at the end. But yes, we will go through at least the beginnings of how to structure a unit. And particularly this person has issues with the Yotzer Or and the Ma'ariv Aravim prayers. That even though the words are not necessarily difficult, although in the Ma'ariv there are a couple of really good ones, same in the Yotzer, but that the kids really don't relate well to those two particular prayers. And on a similar, in a similar vein, one teacher said that it's part of the portfolio is to teach the Ashrei, and that it's a very challenging text for students, and would like suggestions on how to tackle teaching a long text. So what I'll say about Ashrei to begin with is that it has all of the difficulties of being a long passage and also being a passage kids can't relate to, and it's a particularly trying thing. In terms of long passages, the only thing to do is to split them into manageable chunks, and not to try to teach the whole passage at once, and to just do it over several sessions. I don't have great suggestions for Ashrei. I will think about it, but I would suggest for anybody's who's got a unit like this to that they have to deal with is to follow the same basic steps that we're going to go through with the Yotzer and the Ma'ariv. I apologize, I didn't get the Ashrei question until later, and I'd already put together the stuff for Yotzer and Ma'ariv because that came in very early. So what I'd suggest is that you just follow this basic pattern. So the first thing you have to do is figure out what the key concept of the prayer is. And sometimes it's very much up front in the text, and sometimes it's kind of hidden a little bit in the text. In the Yotzer Or, what has always struck me as being the most important concept that this covers is actually a quote from Talmud, Uvetuvo mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishit. The idea that creation was not something that was done one time a long time ago, but that it is an ongoing process. Every day, the world is a little bit different than it was the day before. And when I discuss this with kids, I ask them to think about examples. What has changed in the world since 2 weeks ago? What has changed in the world of nature since a month ago? And, they can identify the passage of time, the change of the seasons, the days getting longer, the days getting shorter. These are all changes that are completely noticeable to them. And the idea that every day the world is a little bit different and we are a little bit different is something that I think is an entry point for the kids. Then we have certain vocabulary from the Yotzer or obviously, and Choshech. Right? Great words to be able to teach. In the Ma'ariv Aravim, and I limit my my presentation on the Yotzer to those two items because there is an awful lot of very abstract language in the Yotzer and not so much concrete. But the concept is really good in the Yotzer. Lahavdil, the concept is not as rich in the Ma'ariv, but the vocabulary is terrific. So take that for what it's worth. Sometimes you'll get a rich concept and sometimes you'll get richer vocabulary. So the idea is that every day God makes the sun rise and makes the sun set, causes these things to happen. And with vocabulary, we have Yom and Laila. We have Or and Choshech. We have Kochavim. We have Machalif et Hazmanim. Zmanim in this particular instance are talking about the different seasons. And that will give you some ideas of vocabulary that you can have them play with, as well as conceptual material. And I would combine all of that with the reading techniques that we have talked about so far, in terms of word recognition, in terms of different activities that you can do to get them reading word by word and phrase by phrase. And you put all of that together, you've got a fairly rich unit. The next set of questions have to do with the Slingerland approach. The first one was really very interesting. Had to do with keywords for letters. Clearly, you caught on to the fact that the teacher had them come up and identify, L is for lamb and so on and so forth, and they would say L lamb la, or K kite k, or D dog duh. And the question was, does that work for Hebrew as well? And I will say that pretty much every pre-primer in the world has a keyword for each and every one of the basic letters. What I would recommend doing for this, go find a good pre-primer and use those words, or find words that you particularly like to use. I will again stress, separate those things that are similar. So if it's a similar shaped letter, or a letter that makes sort of the same sound but not exactly the same sound, keep them far apart. Do not do samech and tzadi and zayin at the same time. Don't do them anywhere near each other. Keep them as far apart as possible. However, when you have letters that represent identical sounds, teach them together. So you have taf, Torah, ta, tet, talit, ta, kaf, kippah, ka, kuf, kiddush, ka. Again, associating the same sounds together. And the question was, will this confuse a beginning reader? Will they end up reading, every time they see a taf, are they going to read Torah? I've never run into that. I've never had that experience, even with pretty profoundly learning disabled kids. They seem to be able to understand that they're extrapolating letter sounds, probably because they're used to doing this with English. They have all had the experience of A is for apple and B is for ball and C is for cat and so on. They seem to understand that concept. So I've never actually seen that particular problem. The problem that I think you do see is a kid seeing a four-letter word that starts with a bet and immediately assuming it's Baruch. That tends to happen, and it tends to happen in passages where there are not familiar words, and they are trying to read them at the same speed that they would read an English passage.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Can
Sure.
I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
So that was my question, and the reason why that came up was I don't teach beginning Hebrew or beginning letters usually, so I wanted to figure out a way that I could use this in a way that makes sense for sixth graders. And what I would like to do is use some of the vocabulary in the prayers. So it sounds like that's a good approach for the older kids.
Totally good approach. It works with little kids too. Obviously, every pre-primer in the world is built that way. And what you might want to do is go back and take a look at the primer and pre-primer that the kids used to learn how to read, and borrow keywords from that as well. I will say the typically difficult word, the very difficult letters to come up with keywords for are Vav and Zayin. There is not a good keyword for Vav, just isn't. There is not a good keyword for Zayin either, especially from prayer vocabulary. So Zayin, everybody ends up using zebra, and for Vav, the closest one that you get usually is Vered, which means rose. Although I did see Vashti in one book and thought that was kind of a clever Vav letter, clever word for Vav. But those are very hard to come up with. And I would go to the pre-primer, not the primer, because a pre-primer will have a keyword for every letter, and a primer will have letters embedded somewhere in the keyword. They don't all necessarily start with it. So I think that's a great idea.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next set of questions had to do with the multisensory approach from Slingerland. The question was, it can be fast-paced, and do struggling students get lost or unnoticed? It's a great question. Yes, it can be fast-paced, but you as the teacher control the pace at which it's done. So I know in the video we had pretty fast-paced demonstrations, but keep in mind that in the English language videos, those kids have been rehearsing to do that for a while. This was not their first opportunity to try reading those words. And with the Hebrew demo, this was all teachers that were involved in doing it. So their skill level and fluency in Hebrew was already going to be a little higher than you'd expect from 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th graders. So the beauty of this particular approach is that you don't lose the struggling students. As the teacher, your job is, you put your pointer underneath the phrase and then you demonstrate it and then you watch your class. And any student that's not participating, you're going to intervene with. You're going to remind them that they need to focus in and do this. The other thing that will happen is when you have different students taking a turn to go up and demonstrate for the class, pretty early on who your weaker students are. You're not going to call on them first. You're going to let them watch this done 2 or 3 or 4 times before they have to go and perform. And as a result, it gives them a chance to hear it, see it, watch a demonstration, watch a model of it a few times before they're called on. So my take with this particular approach is the kids don't get lost, and the struggling students don't fall through the cracks so easily, because if they're not participating, you're watching them. And after 2 or 3 times through, they know they're being watched. So it tends to work well. And the second question was having students doing reading in unison. Do timid students go unnoticed? Also a great question. They could, but again, you're mixing it up so that, yes, they're reading in unison, but then they're doing stuff individually also. And as in my classes, when we practice, once they've gone through this, they've done the introduction to the phrases, and so once they have been through this a few times, then I have them do stuff in small groups. Again, with 22 students, I don't have time to listen to everybody read all the time. So what I do instead is I'll divide them up into groups of 3 and have them come up and read for me. Or I'll have 3 of them read in unison together. I can always hear 3 different voices. And if somebody really can't be heard, that's a student that's going to spend some more extra quality time one-on-one with me.
Could I ask a question about that?
Absolutely.
So if students are timid, do you really think that they're going to want to come up to the front of the room and do something?
I have never had a kid refuse to do it. I have had them come to me privately and say they're uncomfortable with it. And, I will talk to them and, give them lots of extra time before calling them up. But eventually, everybody needs to be able to come up into the front of the room and do something. Ultimately, when they're 13, they're going to be called up into a front of a much larger room with a much bigger audience, and they're going to have to do more than read one phrase. So,
yeah, sure, b'nai mitzvah.
Yeah, and trust me, part of our job is getting them to the point where they're not afraid of doing that. Some kids it takes a little extra time with. I will tell you a story. When I was school director, I had a young man. His class was leading a weekday service. We didn't do a Shabbat for each class because we had too many classes. There were 650 kids in the school, so there were a lot of classes. But every group did, every class did a weekday service at some point during the year. We invited their parents. So at the dress rehearsal, now he'd been doing fine in class. He read for his peers. He read for his teacher. It was no problem. During the dress rehearsal on the bima, he freaked out completely and couldn't read. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't move. He was frozen. So the teacher sent for me, and I sat with him for a while, and we talked about it. And I said to him, I'm not going to make you lead this on your own. Come and stand next to me while I lead it, or lead it with me. He couldn't even stand next to me when we actually got to the service. So I had a long conversation with his mom. It turned out that he went through precisely the same anxiety about baseball. First time he was on a little league team, he could not perform because there were people watching. So his coach and his family had him come at a time to the field when there was nobody there, and he practiced running from home plate to first base. until he could do that. And then he practiced hitting a ball until he could do that. And then they had him do just those things with his family sitting in the stand, and so on and so forth, until eventually he built up enough confidence that he was able to do this with other people watching. So I said, this is a perfectly wonderful approach. This is how we'll cure him of his bemophobia. So I had an adult tutor working with him. The tutor would take him into the sanctuary whenever it was time for him to be tested on a prayer individually. They would go into the sanctuary. The kid would stand on the bema, and the tutor would sit in the congregation or would move around in the congregation until this kid could read the prayer without worrying about where he was or who was there. And then we would bring other people in. So we had some of his classmates would come in, and then kids from another class that he didn't know, and adults we would bring in. And eventually, he was cured of this particular kind of phobia. His bar mitzvah, you never would have known he had any anxiety ever. But I have to tell you, we started with that at about the middle of 5th grade, and at the end of 7th grade was his bar mitzvah. So we had a long time to go through that process. Some kids need that. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Okay. The next issue, which is related, is the issue of phrase reading. One question was, I noticed that all the examples had only 3 or 4 words per phrase. Should longer phrases be broken up into smaller sections? That's a very interesting observation. The more I've thought about it, the more I think that most phrases really are 3 or 4 words long. There are certainly phrases that are longer. I wouldn't break them up. I would keep the longer phrases longer, but I would teach these out of order. So if you have a phrase that's only 2 words in the passage, start with that one. And then the 3-word phrases, do those. And then the 4-word phrases, and so on and so forth, until you can get kids built up to being able to do 4, 5, 6 words at a time. But yeah, I wouldn't divide them further. Second, is there a maximum number of words per phrase? I think so, and it probably is however many words you can do in a single breath, because that tends to be how phrases are done. It's about breathing and following the same pace as conversation. And then the other part of that is, are there any other ways specific to Hebrew for determining the phrases within any given text? And the answer is yeah. If you listen to the melody, it's broken into phrases. And the melodies are designed to follow the phrasing of the passage. That's true in Torah trope. That's true in any of the Siddur passages that are set to music. If you listen to the musical phrasing, that will tell you exactly what the phrasing is in the text as well.
I just wanted to add, so and also when the words themselves have phrases within them. Like sometimes words have, I get this from my students all the time, which is, what's this little pipe character that's underneath some of the letters? And it's actually an accent mark.
Right.
And so, you know, I know the topic was on phrasing among words, but within the words themselves, sometimes you need to phrase it out. Like a couple of weeks ago, one of my students was reading Torah, and he kept on stumbling across the word ha'amalaki.
Yeah.
And, ha'amalaki. I still can't say it now. And so we noticed that, you know, every other letter had an accent mark under it. And once he realized that, then he was able to say it without hesitation, much better than I just did just now.
Interesting. Yeah, it is true. Words definitely have a rhythm to them, and there's a pattern within the accenting of individual words. But it's one thing when a student can read an individual word, they may or may not be able to put those words together into a nice, smooth phrase, which ultimately we need them to be able to do. especially if they're singing. You can't sing it one word at a time so easily.
Can I add one more thing to that? You brought up
Sure.
a great point with the phrasing and the melody. One of the things that I really like doing is I created cards, all different colors, and I divided my cards into I color-coded the phrases is what I'm trying to say. And so when one of the ways that I teach this is I give each one or two kids a phrase, not just a word or two words, and it really helps them learn a phrase at a time. And after they've mastered that, I have them stand up, and each grouping does a phrase, and then I have them switch cards until they learn a different phrase. And it seems to work really well. Again, I'm with sixth graders, but it seems to work really well.
I love it. I love anything where you give them stuff that they have to put back together, because they will learn it better that way. It's good to introduce it with this nice gestalt and all of this multisensory piece, but for them to practice it, I love it when they are given a stack of things and told put it in the right order. That's great. Okay, next set of questions had to do with resources. And one was, can I recommend a site for making single word flashcards? There is Pardon me?
I said, guess whose question that is? Miss Flashcard, me.
In terms of, are you talking about making flashcards that can be printed out and then, used that way? Used the way that you're talking about? Yeah, I don't have a great site for that. And the best thing that I do have is Davka, which I know you don't have. This would be a very good investment for your school to make, is to buy a copy of Davka.
Well, they have it. They do have it.
They do. So that would be the way I would go about doing this, unless you have. I do know that, like in the PowerPoint that I did for you, all of the words I actually copied and pasted in from Davka, but then I translated them into Times New Roman because it's a better font. So in Word itself, you can find all of the Hebrew letters and vowels. It's under Insert Symbol, and you can do it that way. It is a painfully slow process. Just warning you, it's not as easy to use as Davka is. Or you can get your version of Word Hebrew enabled so that you can type in the Hebrew. Again, it's not as user-friendly, especially if you're using vowels. So that's my best suggestion on that score. There may be a site, I just don't know of it. I do know that there is a site that will help, that you can make flashcard sets on, that the kids can then use on the computer. And there are various games that the site allows you to play with those cards. The site is called Quizlet. And I'll put the link up to it in Moodle so that you can take a look at it. And again, you can translate from one language to another in it. The Hebrew typewriter, the Hebrew keyboard in Quizlet is not ideal. Again, there are some issues with the vocalization, but it is something that you can use.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And the other was, do I have any other resources to pull games or flashcards from? Games for sure. And one thing that I will say is there are a couple of very good books. There's an old resource called Games to Teach Reading by a woman named Peggy Kay. She is an English reading teacher. She does most of her work, or she did do most of her work, one-on-one tutoring kids who were having problems. And she invented all sorts of games to teach English reading, and most of them can be adapted to Hebrew. I'll be showing you a few of those in this coming session, a couple of ideas, and we'll also give you the resource for her book. So yes, you can go to any program that has games built into it. Any kind of reading program that includes games, they can all be adapted. No matter what the language is, you can adapt them to work with Hebrew. Okay. And we are up to the subject of games. Someone said she would like to see examples of these games in action. I would have loved to have been able to provide that for you. I did go to the school I work in and ask to be allowed to videotape the kids playing games, and the permission was not granted. Even though it was going onto a secure website, they wouldn't even allow parents to give permission on it. So I ran into a major stumbling block with the administration at my school. And you know, it's one of the sad facts of life that we are facing in this particular day and age with the internet and with videos of kids. So I don't have any good videos I can show you of the games in action. Sorry about that. But I can answer some of the sub-questions that were part of that question. For example, how do you split the categories up for what constitutes a difficult word? It is not always the number of syllables. There are certain issues in Hebrew reading that are tricky, whether it's a 2-syllable word or a 5-syllable word. The patach gnuva, which is the patach, the a vowel under a chet or an ayin at the end of a word, where it flip-flops places so that you do the vowel first and then the consonant. That's a much trickier thing. You know, a word like ruach is more difficult in terms of reading than a whole bunch of other longer words might be. Hama'ariv, which is certainly a longer word, is much easier to read than ruach. So I base it in part on number of syllables. I base it in part on how much of a tongue twister the word might be. The Ve'ahavta, which I know somebody mentioned in the discussions that we've had in the forum, Ve'ahavta is an incredibly tricky passage that has lots of tongue twisters in it, and it gives you a whole lot of words that are much more difficult. So it's not just the number of syllables, it's all sorts of things about how easy or difficult a word is to read. And I think most of you, when you look at a word, you're going to know if your kids are going to have trouble with it or not. So that's part one. How do I determine the criteria for the complexity of words? It's what kinds of issues do they contain? Are there issues with the shva, which is impossibly difficult for kids to master easily? Yeah. Okay. Okay. When we play bonk, do we do the whole prayer or part of it? The answer is yes. If we've only studied the first half and we're going to play bonk with it, we're only going to do it with the first half. If we've studied the entire passage and this is just to try to get them up to speed and keep them on the right kind of pace, then we'll do the whole passage. It really depends on the situation. It depends on when it is in the process that we're actually playing the game. Okay, kids who are embarrassed to read out loud. How do you get them interested? This is a tough one because there are kids that are very painfully shy and embarrassed about reading out loud. Interestingly enough, there is a congregation here in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. The rabbi there is Daniel Grossman, who is passionate and dedicated to Jewish special education. So much so that they actually have 2 school directors at their congregational school, one who is the director for the general population and one who is the director for all the special needs kids. This is a congregation that has taken special needs interests to a whole new level. They built their building so it would be accessible to everyone. Everything is ramped. There are hearing amplification systems for people. You name it, they've done it. And he has become something of the national expert on Jewish special education. Interestingly enough, to address the issue of kids who are very shy about reading, they borrowed a method a program that's being used in the secular world of letting kids read to dogs. Even the shyest child is not embarrassed, generally speaking, when it comes to reading to a dog, because the dog is never going to criticize them. The dog is going to give them kisses and wag their tail, and very good dogs are always totally attentive at what a human being is doing. And they have had really remarkable success with this in English reading programs. It's even worked really well in learning to read Hebrew. I toss that out there as a notion that there are programs that have been tried that do work with even severe populations, even the most withdrawn of kids. The question is, can you build a consensus to try these kinds of experimental programs in the place where you're working? So, the other thing I will say is that while a child may be painfully shy about reading a passage out loud in front of the class, they're less hesitant, generally speaking, about it when it's within the context of a game. I can't really remember having a student who refused to play a game because they were too embarrassed. Haven't had that particular experience. I do have kids who don't like bonk because they have to, keep pace with where the reading is going, and they don't necessarily like that particular game, but they will play other games very happily. Okay. Anything else about games or about shy students? Okay. Someone posed a very interesting question. This is a question that is a category all to itself, and that is, what is my feeling about class Shabbatot, where students demonstrate the mastery of what they've been learning in class when they get to do it in front of the entire shul on Shabbat? I don't have a personal feeling about this one way or the other. I have worked in places where this is done. I have worked in places where this is not done. Again, when you have very shy students, they don't really love to do this. But if they're doing it all together as a group, sometimes they're less inhibited about it. I think sometimes congregations, the regulars who come to services love nothing more than seeing little kids up on the bima leading a service, because it gives them a sense of hope for the future. I don't know if it's particularly valuable for the kids or not. I don't really have any feeling one way about it or another on that, with one caveat. I don't want the parents to come to think that this is a performance. I did have a family call my secretary at one point and ask, when do I have to be there for my child's part in the play? It wasn't a play, it wasn't a performance, it was a service. It was not your child has a starring role, it's your child is leading a community in worship. I don't like that particular aspect of it, and I think that we actually do harm, to our cause when we approach it that way. Somebody just came in. I'm going to ask you to mute your microphone if you can, because we're picking up all the sound around you. All right. Anybody else on this particular topic? All right. And then we have the topic of Hebrew language, and what is my feeling about teaching Hebrew, meaningful Hebrew, through tefillah rather than through oral language. I think that oral language always precedes written language, and I think that that's kind of the natural course of things. I think it's very difficult to teach meaningful Hebrew just from the context of a siddur. That's kind of like teaching someone how to read the English alphabet and then handing them Shakespeare and trying to teach them how to understand English through some of the most complicated passages ever written in the language. That's kind of my feeling on how that plays out. There are certainly, historically, there have been attempts to do that, to do precisely this. William Chomsky, who was head of the faculty at Gratz many years ago, and is also one of the leading Hebraists in America. He wrote an entire program on using the reading method to teach language, as opposed to teaching Ivrit be'Ivrit. The idea being that he wanted kids to be able to read classical text. Even he conceded that you have to do a direct kind of method to teach kids at the beginning. That vocabulary in particular, very concrete vocabulary lends itself to that, and it tends to engage the learners more. And the second question on this particular series was, is the goal to read fluently or to understand fluently? And my answer is yes. I want both. I'm an optimist. I want both. I want them to be able to read fluently, and I also want them to understand what it is they're reading. But I know that's not going to happen in 1 year. It's not going to happen in 3 years. It's not going to happen in 5 years. It's going to be a very long-term proposition. The same way that learning to read English is actually a very long-term proposition. I couldn't read the same level of material I'm reading in a doctoral program. I couldn't do that when I was in junior high school. The same is true for Hebrew. You build the skill and you let the skill build on itself. Okay, this brings us to...
Sorry, can I go back to that other topic?
Sure.
So I think one of the differences between... So I'm not sure I agree with your analogy about reading Shakespeare and using that analogy to learning Hebrew by reading the Tefillot. I think that it's different when you teach Hebrew, especially because when you read the Tefillot, I feel that you need to understand what you're reading so that you can develop that personal connection with God. And you're not going to get that by reading Shakespeare, because reading a Shakespeare or other English passage, you're not going to develop a strong connection to God by doing that. And so that's why I feel that, yeah, you need to have some kind of, you need to know what you're saying in your tefillah so that it means something to you. Because otherwise, these students in the Hebrew school, they're not necessarily going to want to learn to read tefillot because it doesn't mean anything to them. What's the point? It's just a bunch of funny characters on a page. I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Okay, accepted. I will say that I think my analogy to Shakespeare is pretty good because of the level of language. The language in the Siddur is of a much higher level, really high level. There are word constructions in there. There are word usages in there that really are very poetic and really sophisticated, so that your average 10-year-old is really going to struggle with that. That was really what
Sure,
I was referring to.
Yeah, I understand you're not going to walk down the street of Israel and say, Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu, that's not the conversation you're going to have with someone on the street, but, it's a start.
There is actually a funny story about Chaim Nachman Bialik. When he arrived in Israel, he went to a cafe in Tel Aviv, and he began speaking essentially biblical phrased Hebrew to the waiter. And you can imagine the waiter's reaction to this. It's true. You're not going to be able to use
on your sandwich?
Right. You're not going to be able to use this if you're walking down the streets of Tel Aviv. I'm not even sure that I'm ready to send them down the streets of Tel Aviv. I want them to have a basic grasp of basic vocabulary first. So one thing I will say is that the brachot provide a beautiful way to do this. But once you get past the brachot, it's very difficult. It's very, very, very difficult to find those nice, solid, concrete words. You saw that with the Yotzer Or, I managed to find two. Yotzer one is Or and one is Choshech. Even Shalom is too complicated on some levels, especially in terms of how it's used in that prayer. So it's tough. It's a tough thing to do when you're talking about some of the more complicated constructions.
Can I add something to what you just said?
Sure.
Even with that, even with, let's say, Yotzer, everything that you said, I try to do, but I also pick out a passage like Oseh Shalom U'Varei Hakol, and I kind of get them excited. I want them to find some magic in some of these words, especially words they can read easily. And this is a passage that they can read easily, and we talk about the meaning of this. Everybody has a different idea about what this means, but I find it fascinating, especially as these young minds are emerging. And so what I try to do is find the easier passages in terms of Hebrew, and then we talk about it in English. I love this passage. I tell them this is my favorite one.
I love it. I'm not saying the Yotzer is not a good passage to teach. It is, and there's a lot of rich stuff in it, but I do think that overall the level of language, the opening bracha is one thing. You get into some of the further along passages, and it's a little harder to do. But I agree, and you can have these whole discussions with them without necessarily using all of the Hebrew vocabulary. Although, I think that's kind of maybe not the way I would want to be doing it, but I sometimes have to do it that way. Sometimes it may be necessary just to be able to get them through it conceptually. Okay, so then we come to a whole category of general problems. How do you maximize time with students who are not in class? How do you send work home? Do you do it on paper? Do you send it through the mail? Do you do it online? What's the most effective way here? What tools and techniques do you use to encourage home practice and study? Do you use reward systems or goal settings? What are your ideas? So I am going to toss this out to you generally and ask you what you think about all of this. It is tough. It is tough. And we are facing an issue. We are facing a time when this is a bigger problem than it was. I think absenteeism is higher. I think the reluctance of families is higher. I think that from the discussions that I saw about online material, that it's great when it's used, but if it's not used, it's not so great.
Uh, I have, this is Cheryl. I do have a couple comments. Number one, I try to send out homework with a newsletter about what we've done in class, and I think I've made a huge mistake. And what I didn't anticipate is that most parents are reading this on their phone. So while I'm typing something on my desktop and it looks like a little letter, but when they're looking at it on their phone, it looks like a 10-page book. So this and this is, I can't be the only one having this problem. So this is something that we have to do this differently. I don't. This is a great question. I need help.
I think that's a brilliant answer, actually. I think that may be part of what the problem is that, what we're sending out, they're seeing differently than we're sending it.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. I think that's a whole separate issue, but it's something to think about. What is the best way to send something that will be viewed on a smartphone as opposed to what would be viewed in an email?
One of the things that we have a SEED conference coming up. I may or may not be talking about communications with parents, but this is a question, and this is a huge concern. I have to come up with some kind of a resolution or some other ideas. One of the things that I did, instead of sending letters one week, was I had the kids go on the Bima, and I asked them to basically pick the most comfortable prayer for them, that they could read. The idea was to get them comfortable up there and be successful. And I videoed like 30 seconds, and I sent it right then and there to their parents. And their parents, I messaged them, and they got an instant response. So they didn't get a letter; they got this that said, "Hey, I'm on the Bima."
I love it. That may be part of the answer. It may be sending these. Pardon me?
Sorry. Go ahead. Finish your sentence. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask a quick question. So is this letter that is being sent out or newsletter or whatever, it's being sent to the parents every single week? Is that how it's working currently?
Yeah, we are asked to send something out every week. So the Sunday-only kids, the kids that only come once a week, and usually, you have a significant amount of kids who are missing Sundays, in which case they miss 2 classes for us. But I want to make sure that the parents know, here's what we accomplished in class, here's what I expect for next time, and whatever else I need to tell them. Usually there's some synagogue stuff going on, and I add that. I mean, that's clearly too much.
Yeah. I would drop
this. What has the feedback been from the parents?
I'm sorry, what was that?
What has the feedback been from the parents? Are they just looking at the first bit and then chucking the rest, or are they engaging so that the student who was out, they don't feel so confused when they come back because their parents are going over it with them? Has anybody commented?
Very rarely do I have feedback, and I've been doing this. I think I was the first teacher to begin sending out emails before it was fashionable, and I got more feedback way back then. Now I think what's happening is that the parents are almost desensitized to these emails because they know that we're sending them out. They know when their kid misses, and I think they just really want it to go away.
I also think that you're right about the desensitization. When we first started using email to contact parents, we got great responses. Now you can send 20 emails out and it's like they don't even read it. Part partly because they just know their email boxes are getting inundated with messages from every organization that they know of. So email has now become something that it's now less effective than it was when we were using paper mail primarily. And then email became the new hot thing. I'm almost thinking that maybe a text message is what you're looking to do. Something really, really short.
How does that convey, other than what I did by sending that 30-second video, but I have to send it individually, which is another time issue. But how does, you know, a 2-sentence text really convey to those parents whose kids are missing regularly what we've done?
Miss Tatala in class did chapter 7. See you next week.
Well, and truth be told, I mean, depending upon the parent, they're not necessarily going to sit down with the child because to work on the Hebrew. I mean, they themselves might not have the skill set to be able to even do that. So it seems to me for you to spend a lot of your precious time to send a very extensive, where I think it's fantastic that you're so good at communicating, maybe a little bit of a more lengthy thing for the students who have missed, but for those students who are there on a regular basis, just touching base, and then maybe on a quarterly or, you know, every 3 weeks or something, maybe a little bit more of an elaborate, or even sending something home paper form, you know, every 3 weeks or so. Because, you know, the problem is you're working so hard to be so good at communicating, and unfortunately, because people are desensitized and because they don't really even have the skill set to teach what was learned and missed, unfortunately, the student is the one that's really hurting, but there are a lot of parents, whether it be a blended family or maybe they didn't even learn themselves, who really just don't even have the skill set to even sit down. It's not quite like, you know, I'm going to work on algebra and I just need to brush up the basics and be able to help my student. It's, you know, a different thing, and if you don't know, you just don't know.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I'll tell you how desensitized I believe that they are. I often attach pictures of stuff that we do. If we're doing like Simon Says, or we have games that we do out in the hallway, because we're working in a public school on Sundays, so I have to find different places to work. We can't even use the room we're in that well for what I want to do. So even when I send these pictures home, I really get very little feedback. It's quite interesting. I wonder if anyone else is having this kind of a concern.
Yes. I think everybody is having a similar concern.
Yeah.
I think that what you have expressed is absolutely one of the major issues that we're facing. It's not even just that parents don't have the skills. There is that to it. It's also that their level of commitment is not necessarily where we would like it to be. It's not that they don't want their kids to succeed. They want their kids to succeed. But they don't want necessarily for them to have to put in the kind of work that we all know is going to be necessary. The other piece is that I don't know if this is, I think this is true nationally. It's certainly true here in New Jersey. The public school workload has become unbearable. That with all of the national testing that elementary school kids are being put through, all of the standardized testing, what the teachers used to teach is now homework. So I have third graders and fourth graders who are getting 3 and 4 and 5 hours a night of homework. That's crazy.
My God.
It's
yeah,
crazy.
That's across the board.
It's across the board. So I, in good conscience, don't love giving a homework assignment to a kid that I know is going home to do 3 hours worth of homework every night.
Plus, they're also involved in all kinds of extracurricular activities, sports, and they're taken out of class early, or
Yep.
all those things.
And that has increased at a time that hours of instruction have been cut.
Right.
It is something of a vicious cycle. But those are problems that none of us can solve individually, but we can at least look at some potential solutions. I love the idea of making short text messaging the answer.
One thing I have found that's very helpful is a short email. Attach a recording of whatever you have taught that day, whether it be a tefillah or a phrase, something. Attach a recording, and I attach the actual worksheet or page. And I also transliterate it for the parents. So they have those resources, but the message is really short. So we're at least presenting, we're doing the best we can and being as helpful as we can. Whether or not they take our resources, that's another question. But I think as long as we're presenting everything the best way and doing the most we can, we're doing a good thing.
Yeah, in the words of Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. You're not required to finish the task. We're not going to be able to solve all of the problems, but we have to do everything we can to make as many steps forward as we can. In my email today, I got the little newsletter from Behrman House. There was an article in it from a media specialist at a congregation here in New Jersey about how to make online learning workable for parents, how to maximize it. And she had some very creative suggestions for things that can be done to get parents more involved in that process, to make them less uncomfortable with it, and to really facilitate it so that it works better. I will also post a link to that because I think that's worth reading. And I have to say, folks, that we have now hit the mark. We are at 8:30, and I have kept you all for an hour and a half. I want to thank you so much for your good comments and attention, and I look forward to working with you the next couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.